Hi, we're going to take some time today to talk about how to take notes for AP Human Geography. A frequent issue my students have is that they struggle with figuring out how much is how much is too little in terms of taking notes. You're going to be doing a college semester's course in a semester, and your exam for the college credit is going to be in May. And so this means that you need to learn this material not just for our unit exam, but for the year. And taking good notes is an important task in that process. In terms of what will you need, you'll need your brain for sure, your book, something to take notes on, and something to take notes with. And I super double recommend taking notes actually on paper with pencil or pen. I know that might not seem fun, and it might seem easier to do it on your computer. It takes less time if you do it actually writing it as opposed to typing it most of the time for most people. But also there's a lot of scientific research that shows that if you write something down, it goes into long-term memory. But if you actually type something, it doesn't go into long-term memory. So what I've noticed is that by actually taking notes, it is an actual study process that helps you in terms of your test preparation. I like to use colored pens and highlighters. That is not a requirement, but I'm just letting you know I enjoy it. So step one is pre-reading. Pre-reading can go a couple different ways. Like it could just be that you're looking through the chapter and looking at the list of key terms at the end and sort of getting a sense for what you're going to be learning about. If you struggle with figuring out what is the most important thing to write down, in my opinion, it is easier to read the chapter one time and then to start taking notes. And then the second time, you're just skimming to sort of figure out what are the key things you want to write down. I generally do this when I read a new history text because I'm bombarded with like new information and everything seems new. So if you are someone who's taking notes and you're taking almost as many pages of notes as there are actually pages in the book, then you are doing this wrong because you're spending way too much time on it and your life is going to be super frustrating, and I don't want that for you. I want you to enjoy this class and I want you to get something out of this class. So for some people, reading the whole chapter is the best way to go first before you write things down, because then you're actually paying attention to what you're reading, and that is what I like to do. And in my opinion, it makes the note taking even easier. So step two is the note taking. At the end of each chapter, they have a list of the key terms, but what I don't want you to do is just write down the key terms and then the vocab, the definitions, be like, boom, I'm done. I took notes on the whole chapter. Nope. First of all, you need to know more than just the vocab terms that were in that chapter. Like they gave you lots of examples of things. They explained a lot of key concepts. Those things don't make it to the key terms list, but you still need to know them. Additionally, because this is a college level class, you are not going to be asked to define key terms. Like that is a very lower level type of skill. Instead, the questions, both the written questions and the multiple choice questions, are going to assume that you know what this vocabulary means. And so you're going to be asked to apply these terms. So you do have to know these terms, but you don't want to just study the terms, okay? So when you're taking notes, it's important not just to take notes on the definition, but also on examples of these terms. So if you look at some of my notes that I took, and I wrote at the top, this refers to pages 26 and 27 in your book, but I'm not telling you that because you should do that on the top of all of your notes. If you notice here, I wrote a heading, geospatial data, and I wrote the definitions in one color, and then my notes on those definitions another color. That is totally not required, but that makes me happy, so I do it. So if you look here, I wrote the definition for field work, collecting geospatial data in the field. It was observed and recorded on location. And then I wrote examples, census, interviews, observations, land surveys, photographs, sketches. So you don't want to just write down the definition. You also want to write down the examples of it. But if you look at what I did for GPS, I wrote GPS, I can't even read my notes here. GPS receivers on the Earth's surface use the location of satellites to determine and record a receiver's exact location. And then I wrote a note to myself, this is exactly what we use on cell phone for when we go to Carol's so that we don't get lost. Okay, that's my example. That's going to stick in my brain longer than just writing down the examples from the book, because now I'm relating the example to my own life. So you don't have to just write down the examples from the book. You can also write down examples that are meaningful for you. So if you look at when I wrote down for qualitative data, I wrote not usually represented by numbers. Examples are interviews, document archives, descriptions, and visual observations. In my History Day project, I quoted personal interviews about World War I. So I wrote the examples the book gave, but I also wrote a personal example that means, boom, I'm not going to get quantitative and qualitative data confused because I wrote down an example. Okay? When you look in the book, they give you the definition for qualitative data that can be measured and recorded using numbers, frequently used with GIS, but they didn't give you an example of quantitative. So I wrote down an example because I was using my brain, and I wrote down household income equals an example. If when you're taking notes, if you cannot come up with an example, then you want to write yourself a note that you want to talk to a peer or me or somebody so you can get in, or do your own Google search or do some independent reading. But you're going to want, if that term is important, you're going to want to have some examples. And those could be from the book, those could be from your life, but you need to have examples because otherwise these terms are just going to fly out of your brain and they're not going to stick. And that's important. Okay? I like to use headings, colors, indenting. I also put I put little markers, when I'm getting to a new point. And these things help me be able to find my notes more readable. Okay, I also like to put the headings for different sections and stuff so that later, if I'm going back to read my notes, I can go, oh, yeah, that doesn't make sense now. It made sense when I took them, but now I'm restudying for the big test, and this is April, and I wrote these notes in October. I don't remember what that is. But if I've got things like what chapter it is, I've got the heading, then I can remember and figure out how I'm supposed to go back to that section of the chapter. And then if I reread that section, oh, maybe these notes will make more sense. Okay? But I think that's important. One thing that you're going to note, like if we take a start at the beginning of the chapter where it talks about the spatial perspective, I wrote down the essential question because that's sort of the guiding principle for the whole chapter. You don't have to. I wrote down a lot of words for spatial approach, right? Including the definition, all the different things it would pay attention to. And then I wrote me an example. The historians are looking at what happened at a moment in time. Geographers are looking at how people's ideas or use of the space changes. Geography uses spatial analysis. That example is not given in the book. That is me writing a note to myself, applying this information so that goes into long-term memory. What you need to think about when you're writing down notes is, I don't know if you need to write all of that. Maybe you already know what spatial approach means, and so therefore you don't need to write it down. The most common mistake my students make is, particularly at the beginning of doing this geography together, is they only write down something if they didn't understand it. You can understand what you're reading, but that doesn't mean that you're going to remember it later. So you could read the whole definition of spatial approach and be like, yep, that made sense, I'm moving on. But that doesn't mean later that you could answer a question that says, please can compare and contrast the use of spatial analysis in these two maps. You might be like, what? And so what you want to do is figure out, and this is the $25 million issue with taking notes, is how much you need to write down so that these notes will be useful for you. And what is useful for you in September might not be useful for you in January. This is going to be an evolving set of skills. So just because I wrote down this much here does not mean that your notes have to say that same amount of information, because I don't know what type of knowledge you come to me with. Maybe you already got spatial analysis down hardcore in 8th grade, you're good to go. But I'm just trying to get you to think critically about what you write down. You should not have your brain on low setting, taking notes and just being like, I am merely copying things that are in the book. What I'm trying to get you to realize is that taking notes is a very active mental process, because you're trying to create notes that are going to be useful for you as opposed to trying to recreate the chapter. That is not what I'm asking you to do. One of the reasons why I chose this book is because I personally think that it is a great starter college textbook to help you. So first of all, it's got the key terms in the back. And so when you should make sure that you've got those in your notes. You've got examples of them as I talked about. It's got quiz questions at the end of the chapter. If you can't answer those quiz questions when you're done taking notes and reading the chapter, then you did not take notes on the right things. You read the chapter, but it went in one eyeball and out the other. So those quiz questions at the end are super double helpful for you. Okay? They also have at the end of the chapter these practice free response questions. And I'm not necessarily going to assign you to do those practice free response problems. I'm not going to necessarily assign you to do the geographic thinking exercises. I'm not necessarily going to assign you to do the free response questions or the quizzes. But the fact is that if you can't do those, then that means that you didn't master the material. You read the material, but you have not put it into long-term memory. You have not figured out how to assess it. And so I'm trying to tell you that for you, if you're trying to figure out, did I take enough notes? Did I read it well enough? Do my notes cover the right things? If your brain and or your notes can't do those things afterwards, then that's giving you a clue. Hey, guess what? Nope, I didn't take enough notes. I like to think of note-taking strategies like a buffet. Some teachers are going to be very formulaic and tell you this is exactly how we're going to take notes. We're going to use the Cornell method, or we're going to use this method or that method. And what I think is important, and this is a college level study skill, is that you need to learn what works for your brain. Different things work for different people. I showed you these types of notes because that's what works for my brain. But your brain might like these types of notes better. So this is using the pages 24 through 26 in your book. Regions are like one of the most important concepts in this whole class because we're going to be using regions when we talk about urban geography, agricultural geography, industrial geography, cultural geography, population geography. Every type of geography we're going to talk about regions. So understanding this concept is important. And so you could do a mind map. Like you could take your notes on regions this way. It doesn't have to be done this way. But what's important for you to do as a part of this class is to figure out what works for your brain. Does it work better to do this type of note taking? Does it work better to do this type of note taking? Does it work better to do the whole reading and then take notes? Or can you read and take notes at the same time? You need to figure these things out because you are your own person and your brain works a different way than other people do. These are some common questions I get. How long should my notes be? And these answers are from at Think Fiveable, meaning that like they're trying to get you to get a 5 on the AP exam. And what they're if you look here, they're saying that notes from a 30-page textbook chapter should be around 4 to 6 pages. So if that helps you sort of figure out, yep, I'm taking too much. No, I'm not taking enough. How do I know what to write down? You can see that they have, they offer you some advice. I think that our book gives you some particular methods of figuring out whether or not you should write it down, like the keywords at the end, the multiple choice questions, the free response questions, etc. How can I take less notes with my? How can I take less time with my notes? And they're suggesting that you spread it out over a couple different nights. That works for different people. Some people like to do the chapter in one setting. Some people like to do the chapter in 2 different settings. It really depends on how your time is, but sometimes spending more time on notes does mean you actually end up doing it slower and therefore taking more time. How can I get better at reading? You're going to be reading a college level textbook. This textbook is a pretty accessible book, but the textbook we're going to use for comparative politics is definitely harder. And so this is a skill that you want to be able to do. But chunking things is their main strategy, and I agree with that. So you could read for a little bit, then go back and take notes for a little bit, then read for a little bit, then go back and take notes for a little bit, or do some each night, or break it up over the course of the weekend. But these are some strategies that they give. Now that you've watched this video, don't forget to do the exit slip at the end so that you can compare your notes with what I've talked about because this is going to be a skill you are going to be working at over the course of the whole year with me. Thanks.